In the middle of a blood-moonlit night and the howling north wind, a child was born. No family name, no father, not a single cry. The court thought it was just a living being. But unexpectedly, it carried the eyes of someone who had lived through many human lives. From a misty, forbidden palace, 2 secrets deep in the eunuch's records. It makes ministers bow, makes thrones wait, and makes history silent. A bronze mirror, a half-broken prophecy, a child that makes the whole court tremble. The son of the bronze mirror, a story never told in official history, but still there, in the memory of the unhealed historical cracks. Catch the full epic fantasy series on the channel. Subscribe and don't forget to ring the bell, because the real secrets are only for those who dare to look in the mirror. Moonlight on Cannin Palace. The late winter moon hung over the roof of Cannin Palace, its pale light shining down on the phoenix-carved stone steps, as if to draw a line between dream and reality, between the divine and flesh. In the silent night, the sound of jade bells rang softly every time the wind blew through the long corridor leading straight to the Queen's palace. Queen Haiyan sat alone, silent as a red lacquer statue. On her head, the jade crown weighed heavily on her forehead, but not as much as the gazes of the many eyes that were focused on her belly, where a creature of unknown origin was stirring. Her hands rested lightly on her belly, not cherishing it, not soothing it. She just kept it like keeping a secret, or a curse. No mate dared to come near her. Since the day she announced her pregnancy, the palace seemed to have frozen. No drums, no gongs, no banquets. There was only a murmur from the backyard, where eunuchs began to whisper, snicker, and bow meaningfully every time they passed by Cannin Palace. Everyone knows that 3 years ago, the late emperor passed away on a night of pouring rain. The funeral lasted 100 days. Then the court established the Council of 3 Elders to run the country. The empress was only 23 years old at that time. White as jade, eyes like morning dew. She vowed to serve the late emperor for the rest of her life, closed the doors, and lived in seclusion in the inner palace, not receiving court guests, and not interfering in political affairs. But now, people say, she is pregnant. The news spread like wildfire. Eunuch Trangium, who held the highest position in the Ministry of Internal Affairs, was the first to quietly confirm the rumor. He had personally seen the maidservant change her bloody dress, heard her retching at the hour of Mao, and personally received orders to order someone to burn the anti-abortion medicine from the Dongvin pharmacy. But what made him shiver even more was that one afternoon he secretly saw her sitting alone on the throne, her eyes turned towards the empty throne, her mouth muttering as if praying. If he were alive, he would have named it. A child without a father cannot carry the king's surname, but carries the bloodline of the harem. Trangium's heart was in turmoil. Part of him wanted to protect that woman, the empress who had personally wiped the blood from his hands after the accident years ago. But the other part of him knew very well, if this child was born without legitimate origins, it would be the spark that would burn down the entire imperial court. Cannin Palace was then closed for 49 days. No one went out, no one came in, only the moonlight, each night brighter. Each night clearly reflected her growing belly like a full moon. One night, while the wind blew in through the window, she took some flower paper and wrote a few lines in red ink, then folded it and placed it in a jade box by her bedside. Trangium accidentally saw that handwriting. This is not my fault. This is the fate of a dynasty that has fallen asleep in illusion. And then he understood she had no intention of hiding it. She will let the child be born. She will let it appear like a thunder in a cloudless sky. The next morning, the sky suddenly changed. Mist covered the entrance to the palace as if heaven and earth were in doubt. The first palace maid opened her mouth and asked softly, "Who is the father of the fetus?" No one answered, because in the harem, there are questions that do not need answers, just a look to understand or to fear. Part 2. The eunuch who knew too much. Trangium had never felt so tired. In his early years in the interior ministry, he had experienced a severe drought, a season of famine and moldy rice, and a season of mourning that left 16 eunuchs dead in the Tannan Palace. But never had his heart felt like it was about to burst out of his chest just because of a piece of paper with red ink. Those words, "the fate of a dynasty that has fallen asleep in illusion," still echoed in my head like the sound of a drum beating in the middle of the night. And the person who wrote those words was none other than the current Queen Aina, a woman who had sworn to remain chaste at the coffin of the late emperor, a model of virtue whose name was engraved in the stele of the Imperial Academy, a symbol of etiquette and loyalty. And now she was carrying a child. Trangium was no ordinary eunuch. He was called the silent penman of the royal palace because he not only took care of clothing and logistics, but it was also the one who reviewed secret edicts and reports from the southern provinces and the northern border. Every rumor, every secret letter, had to pass through his hands before reaching the eyes of the Council of 3 Elders. So, he knew very well, there were rumors that should not be ignored, and there were truths that were more terrifying than lies. The news of the Queen's pregnancy spread outside the palace less than a week after he saw the note, and as he had predicted, it began to stir up under the cabinet sent letters of congratulations continuously. Generals close to the late emperor, especially Duke Ledung, suddenly returned to their hometowns, not attending the spring festival as usual. At Linvan Pagoda, incense was also burned to pray for peace, but not for the country's peace and prosperity, but for the heir of unknown origin. He knew that if he did not act, the blood growing in the queen's womb would bring about a purge. One rainy night, Trangium ordered his confidant to open the secret archive, where top-secret documents of previous kings were kept. He found the file sacked to Via Hong Hao Haiyan, which was the royal decree from 7 years ago. The sharp dragon characters, the order directly handwritten by the late emperor, affirmed that Hianyan was the queen, the keeper of the Jade Seal, and had the right to choose a successor. If there was no emperor to succeed her, he closed his eyes. Just as he had sensed, the queen had the right to decide on the successor if the court did not have time to establish a king. The cards were already laid out by her, and that child could be the ace. But the bigger question still lingered in his mind. Who was the baby's father? The late emperor had passed away 3 years earlier. Before his death, he had been kept under strict surveillance. The empress had never once left the harem during her mourning period, and after the court banned all contacts between men and women in the inner palace, she lived like a hermit in the royal garden. So, who? He quietly checked the entry and exit log of the inner palace. Under the oil lamplight, a strange name appeared. Medical recorder Lin Ru Lamnu, a young famous physician who studied at Tichlin Pagoda, was summoned to the palace because of his ability to diagnose illness without touching the pulse. Entered the palace 9 times in the 2 months before the queen was believed to be pregnant. Each visit lasted more than half an hour. Reason: treating internal fire. Trangium put down the book, his heart pounding. He had met Lamnu, a man whose eyes seemed to see through people's hearts. Just by looking at him, he felt trembling, and if that gaze had ever been directed towards the queen. He stood up. That night, when the moon was as dim as a lampstand, Trangium went to his private room and took out a thin notebook with a dark blue cloth cover. This book was not in the archives. This was his private record where he recorded things that were never allowed to be written in history books. He wrote, "On January 8th, the queen seemed to have planned a new dynasty. The one who brought the seed for the throne was not a god, but perhaps a physician. I don't know, I can't be sure. But I feel the wind is changing direction." Then he blew out the light. In the darkness, he knew he was no longer a scribe. He was the keeper of the door between 2 dynasties. And that door, once opened, could never be closed again. The shocking harem, who was the father of the child. The rumor, a nameless poison with the power to destroy an entire dynasty, had spread beyond the walls of the Forbidden City, seeping through the Moscovet corridors into the ears of the palace maids, and even into the dinner trays of the officials bowing their heads in the morning. All eyes began to turn to the Kanin Palace, where the young queen still kept herself in the dark every day, guarding something no one dared to name out loud. An unclaimed fetus. Those 3 words, Jess said softly, are enough to make one's blood run cold. In all of history, there has never been a widowed queen who became pregnant after the death of her king. Not only was it a violation of etiquette, but it was also a fatal blow to the legitimacy of the dynasty. A child born without a father, no matter how noble the bloodline, would be a disaster. But what frightened the courtiers most was not the truth, but the hypotheses. The first hypothesis comes from the left minister Deng Fak, a man famous for his deep and sharp tongue. During a tea party at the palace, he lowered his voice. The queen lived in seclusion for 3 years. Apart from a few servants, only one person was allowed to come and go freely: the eunuch Trangium. That sentence was like an arrow shot straight into the heart of the inner palace. Those who heard it sneered. Those who thought about it were startled. If it was really Trangium, then it was not only an abuse of power, but also a reversal of morality. How could a eunuch, who had undergone the pure body, who was no longer able to sow seeds, be the father of the child? It seems absurd, but the more absurd it is, the faster the rumor spreads. The second hypothesis comes from the former concubines, those who lived in the shadow of Empress Haiyan. When the late emperor was still on the throne, someone pouted. Didn't he once have someone repair the imperial flower garden for 6 months? No one was allowed to enter. He even summoned Master Lin Ru under the pretext of prescribing an exorcism. What exorcism was he doing all winter and spring? A gardener recounted seeing a yellow-shirted figure walking in the middle of the garden when the moon had just risen, holding a book and smiling. Their hypothesis is scary because it seems plausible, and Lam knew the medical monk from Tichlin Temple disappeared from the capital from then on. That sign made people believe even more. He was the one who sowed the seeds. But then one drizzly afternoon, a strange letter was sent to the Interior Ministry. The paper was thin, the ink was smudged, but the handwriting was strong and full of sadness. If the blood growing in the harem's womb is the result of lightning between 2 worlds, then that birth is the will of heaven, not man. No signature. Trangium read the letter, his hands trembling. What did the phrase "between 2 worlds" mean? Darkness and light, gods and humans? Or was it a reference to not? The Council of 3 Elders began to feel the pressure. Before them was a court without a king, only a ruling council. Behind them were thousands of eyes of the civil and military mandarins. And in the middle was the growing belly of a widow. They decided to hold a secret meeting in the imperial hospital. No drums, no gongs, just 3 imperial robes and an imperial edict placed in the middle of the table. The only question that rang out in the darkness if the child is born, will it be called the son of the emperor? No one answered, because if they answer yes, they will have to admit their own inability to maintain etiquette. If they answer no, they will overthrow the very throne that awaits an heir. What about Huan Yen? She remained silent. No confirmation, no denial, no begging for forgiveness. She let her belly grow as a challenge. Every morning, she stood in front of the bronze mirror, combed her hair, and put on a blood-red brocade robe. In her hair, the phoenix hairpin given by the former emperor was still in its original place, as if to remind the court she was the legitimate wife. No one could depose her. When a maid asked her, "Your Majesty, are you afraid?" If the child, she just smiled, very lightly, but also very deeply. "I am not afraid, because if I were, I would have abandoned it when it was still a drop of blood." That night, a strong wind blew from the north of the citadel. The third watch drum beat an unusually long beat. Trangium looked up at the sky and saw the clouds swirling. In his heart he knew, a dynasty is beginning to shake, and the first heartbeat will be in the womb. The honey scroll and the blood amulet spring was just beginning. But inside Kanin Palace, the air was colder than December. On the tiled corridors, the wind howled in long gusts like the lament of a prisoner. The white plum blossoms in front of the porch fell one by one, falling onto the faded red carpet, as if foretelling something ominous. It was during those days that a small, seemingly meaningless discovery shook the harem once again. The story begins with a young palace maid named Nuaning. She was newly recruited into the palace, a servant in charge of boiling water, changing clothes, and sweeping away incense ash in the queen's bedroom. One afternoon, while cleaning a corner of the boudoir, her hand touched the groove of the mahogany bed. Feeling something hard under the mattress, she curiously lifted the mattress. A piece of red cloth, as small as a palm, tied with colorful thread, lay there quietly. On the cloth, embroidered with black thread, was a tiny human figure with a bright red dot in the middle of its forehead. The thread was frayed, but the bloodstains around it were still fresh, as if they had just dried. Her hand shook. Everyone knew what it was. A blood talisman. Who is it for? Used for protection or suppression. Not daring to keep it for long, Nuon Ngok handed it over to the warden on duty. From there, the matter reached Trangium's ears in just half a day. When Trangium held the talisman in his hand, his heart turned cold. As someone who had studied ancient classics, he recognized the pattern on the talisman as belonging to a very rare branch of talisman, the type used in reincarnation rituals. According to ancient legends, when a soul has not yet been liberated, but is brought into a new body, people will use a blood talisman to fix the soul to avoid ghosts taking over the body or the spirit rebellious. But if that's true, then who performed the ritual? And what soul is being kept in the queen's belly? Trangium did not dare to speculate further. That night he secretly went to Thursday Kak, where old edicts from previous dynasties were kept. In a small room full of dust and rotten wood, he found a small edict roll, without the dynasty name or seal, but the handwriting was familiar. The strong, somewhat hasty strokes of the previous emperor. Above is a short code snippet. If anything dangerous happens to my bloodline, use the reincarnation method according to the forbidden ritual at Fuvan Cave. The person performing the ritual must be a virgin or someone who owes the country a favor. The writing stops abruptly, without any endpoint. It seems to have been torn apart or written in a fit of panic. Trangium sat in front of the rolled-up mat for an entire hour. So someone had planned to do this beforehand. Perhaps when the late emperor was still alive, or after he fell ill. The next morning, Trangium asked to see the queen. She received him in silence. Her face was pale, her long hair fell over her shoulders, but her eyes were still straight, not evasive. He placed the talisman on the ebony table and said softly, "I've found this. I hope your majesty can give me some guidance. Because if it wasn't you who did it, then it was someone who was cursed." The queen looked at the object for a long time. Then she placed her hand on her stomach and softly replied, "It's a charm for the child. Not to curse, but to protect." "Protection from who, my lady?" She did not answer, just said, "Free from fate. Free from those who decide the fate of others with their mouths and brushes." Then she looked straight into his eyes. "If a creature comes from grace, then why do people only see it as a disaster?" The words made him choke. As a eunuch, he had been strict with himself all his life, more strict with himself than anyone else. But when he looked into her eyes, the eyes of a mother about to bet everything on her unborn child, he felt something break inside him. After that day, Trangium secretly ordered people to keep a closer watch around Kanin. Besides ensuring safety, he also ordered a collection of all medical records, reincarnation rituals, and ancient charms from Fuvan, the place mentioned in the torn-up edict. Among them, a tattered handwritten note of a lost Taoist priest reads, "When a child is born between life and death, truth and falsehood, love and human, It no longer has a human destiny. It is a mirror. Anyone who looks into it will see themselves. He folded the record and placed it next to the imperial edict. At some point, the wind blew outside, like a call from an old world, filling his heart with a vague fear. Because he understood, the child about to be born not only carried the secret of a queen but was also a mirror reflecting the entire darkness of this dynasty. Interrogation in the wallflower prison beneath the Kando Palace, which used to be the study room of the late emperor. There exists a secret cellar with a beautiful name, the Flower Prison. It is called Flower, but no flowers ever bloomed there. There is only cold stone, dim lights, and dragon-carved walls, eroded by time. It is where the dynasties used to investigate cases that could not be tried publicly. Crimes that even the royal court did not want to be engraved on the stone stele of history. One afternoon, without warning, Queen Heian Yen was summoned there. The sky was gray and quiet that day. Fog covered the stone steps leading underground. The palace maids escorting the queen were held back on the ground. Only Tran Jiam was allowed to follow, in the role of neutral witness. His hands clenched, his sleeves, his index fingers trembled, but his face remained expressionless. He understood. From this moment on, every breath would be a step across the thin line between honor and destruction. 3 members of the Council of 3 Elders were already waiting inside the prison. One of them, Grand Tutor Wenyu, sat in the middle, with silver hair and a whisk in his hand. He was known to be as cold as an icy sword. The other 2, Censor Shangren and Left Prime Minister Li, both bowed their heads, their hands placed on the stone table, as cold as their temperament. The queen did not bow. She entered, as silent as a gray cloud covering the palace. On her head was a phoenix-shaped hairpin, and the veil covering her shoulders fluttered lightly with her breathing. Her figure did not tremble, although her belly was clearly bulging. Grand Tutor Van Du spoke, his voice rumbling like a wooden fish. "May I ask, the fetus in your majesty's womb, is it the late emperor's child?" The air was as thick as undried candle wax. Liu Yuan asked again, his voice sweet but cold. "If so, please provide evidence. Otherwise, I'm afraid it will bring harm to the country's laws." She still did not answer. The censor general flipped through a scroll. According to the records of the Imperial Hospital, the late emperor was seriously ill for the last 8 months of his life and was unable to be near women. Furthermore, the day the empress confirmed her pregnancy was exactly 2.5 years before his death. "May I ask, whose child is this?" The queen's eyes closed slightly, then opened. In her eyes were not tears, but fire. "It is from heaven." The 3 people in front were all stunned. No one expected a pregnant woman to speak so calmly, as if she was the one holding the sword, not the one being questioned. Tran Jiam clenched his fists even more. The Prime Minister said sternly, "Does your Majesty understand that such a statement, if not verified, could be considered blasphemous?" She smiled very slightly. "I understand, but you also understand. There are things that do not need to be proven by paper. They live in the blood, in the air, in the breath. Future generations will understand." A thin breeze blew through the dungeon, causing the lanterns to sway. At that moment, Tran Jiam felt the queen's hand gently caressing his belly, the movement as gentle as soothing his soul. The interrogation lasted 3 hours. No matter how many questions were asked, how many times people pressed, how many laws were cited, she still said only 3 things. "This is my son, this is fate. If I must die, I will die as a mother." Not once did she mention her father's name. Not once did she bow her head. That calmness made the 3 Tamlao, who had once made hundreds of officials, tremble. Van Du wrote a single line in the final minutes. "The pregnant woman, the father is not identified, but her spirit is as firm as a copper pillar. If it is a disaster, it will soon be revealed. If it is a blessing, it will bloom on its own." As he left the Hotuang Vai prison, Tran Jiam walked more slowly than usual. Each step on the cold stone steps seemed to carve another scar into his heart. Behind him, the queen walked without saying a word, only holding her hand to her stomach, and her eyes staring straight ahead into space. She was no longer a pregnant woman, he knew. She was a symbol of indomitability, of unquenchable faith, and of a truth the court was trying to bury. And he, once again, was the witness. The sole witness of a battle of wits, in which the winner was not the one with power, but the one with faith in the invisible. Birthday blood, laughter, and the north wind. The moon was as dim as a piece of silver lost in the incense smoke. The wind blew through the tiled roof of Kanin Palace like the lament of old souls. That night, dark clouds rolled in from Tavine Mountain. The sky was covered by a red lunar eclipse, a rare event that historians had recorded during the True Dynasty, when a prince, born between 2 times, started 10 years of war. And in the middle of that night, when the sky and earth seemed to sink, Heian Yen went into labor. The painful screams from Kanin's back palace sent shivers down everyone's spines. No one was allowed in, except for 3 people. Nuan Ngok, a close palace mate, and an old midwife, who had followed the late emperor since the war in the north. Even though he was a eunuch, Tran Jiam still stayed. The midwife grumbled, "No, It's not right. But the queen just waved her hand. If anyone needed to see me give birth, it was him. Because later, only he would dare to say that I was not afraid. And so he stayed, standing in a corner of the temple, amidst the howling wind and the flickering lights. In his hand he held an old stone rosary, the only thing left from the temple of his childhood. Blood gushed out. The queen's breathing became more rapid. The sound of wind and the smell of incense mixed together, as if the human world and the underworld were rubbing against each other. The chants gradually became screams, then turned into choked moans. Outside, thunder rumbled 3 times. Strangely, it was not raining. The hour of Tai came. In the moment when heaven and earth contracted, the child cried out at birth. No, not a cry. His laughter knew on. Ngiok recounted. The baby was just born, eyes wide open, mouth curved as if smiling. Not a single cry, not a single tear, only a strange sound, like the wind blowing through a flute. The midwife shuddered. I have delivered hundreds of cases, and I have never seen a child so calm. He looked at me, straight in the eyes, as if asking, "Who are you?" Trangium walked over and knelt down beside the child. He saw that his tiny hand was tightly grasping something. The late emperor's rosary placed in the coffin 3 years ago. He buried it with him. How did he get it? He wondered. His trembling hand reached out to touch the object. It was cold and heavier than he had imagined. Almost unconsciously, he blurted out, "You come from 2 worlds." The baby opened his eyes. His jet-black pupils reflected the light like 2 deep wells, then smiled again. Trangium said nothing for the rest of the night. He just stood there, next to the queen who had fallen asleep from blood loss. Nuwan Ngiok held the child, wrapped it in red brocade, and softly sang a lullaby of a northern folk song, an unfamiliar melody in the cold palace. The north wind blew strongly, blowing the curtains, shaking the phoenix hairpin at the head of the bed, making a rattling sound as if someone was tapping the rhythm. The sky still red as blood. The next morning, when the news of the queen giving birth to a baby boy spread throughout the palace, 3 palace maids fainted. 2 former concubines asked to be sick and returned to the temple. A priest resigned. What about the child? Recorded in the palace book with a single name written by the queen herself. Thien Han. No family name, no father, only date of birth. The day of transition between the blood moon and the north wind. In Kanin Palace, Trangium stood looking out into the yard. Yellow leaves were falling here and there, but his mind was not thinking about autumn. He was remembering the child's eyes. Eyes that did not belong to a newborn, but belongs to one who lived a long time ago and is returning. Secret diary. Diary of a eunuch. Trangium never believed in fate. During his 40 years in the palace, he believed in discipline, in paperwork, in sounds that were never written down in history books. Sighs when the palace lights went out, furtive footsteps through the stone corridors, snickers behind polite smiles. But from the night Thien Han was born, he could not help but believe. Without belief, it is impossible to explain why a newborn baby opens its eyes and looks straight at you like an elder. Without belief, how can one explain the blood moon lasting 3 nights in a row, or the thunder striking in the middle of a freezing winter sky? If you don't believe it, then who will write down what happened? And so, he began to write, not in the public records, not in the royal records, but it was in a thin, black leather-covered book, with a very simple name, Secret Records. The first line was written with his left hand, the hand he retaught himself after a tendon rupture. If one day history denies what we have seen, let these words tell it with a sigh. He recorded everything, from the queen's interrogation in the Ho Tuong Vai dungeon, her stony eyes as she said, "My child is from heaven," to the way the child was born, not crying but smiling. He described each of the strange manifestations in detail. Thien Han, only 3 days old, reacted to the sound of a flute. When someone accidentally let a strong light shine on his face, the child did not flinch, but instead covered his eyes in the same way as Taoists do to avoid evil spirits. He even recorded his dream, that he saw the late emperor standing by the cradle, stroking the child's hair, then turning to him and saying, "You don't need to remember my name. Remember who is my successor." The record gradually thickened. There were not only accounts, but also doubts. At times, Trangium wrote, as if talking to himself, "Maybe I am old, my eyes are dim, my heart is soft. But if I am wrong, why does my heart ache when I think of the future that the child will have to bear?" He was not a father, nor a mother, nor a guardian, but from the day he was born, he felt like a prison guard, except that the prison was between 2 eras, where the darkness had not yet ended, and the light had not yet reigned. When Thien Han was 2 years old, he began to speak. The first word was not mother, nor was it milk, but it is mirror. When asked, "What are you saying?" it pointed to the bronze mirror on the queen's dressing table and said, "Someone is calling me." The queen was silent. As for Trangium, he could not sleep that night. In his notes, he wrote, "Mirror is a reflection, but if it does not reflect the present but a past that has never been lived, then is it possible that people are looking into their own past lives? One day he tried something daring. He placed a series of objects in front of Thien Han: a flute, a chess piece, a Buddha scripture, and a pen. The boy chose the pen. No wonder. But the strange thing was, he didn't play with or suck on the pen like other children do. Instead, he picked it up, put it on the paper, and drew. He drew a tailless dragon. The record of that day recorded a tailless dragon. Is it this dynasty? Is it me? Or is it drawing itself? Trangium gradually ceased to be a unit. In his heart, he became the scribe of a catastrophe. And as he watched Thien Han grow day by day, the way it never cried when it fell, never smiled when it was rewarded, he felt like he was living with a king who had not yet ascended the throne. An old soul had entered a new body. At the end of each page of his diary, he always left a blank line. Just one line, nothing written. He once told Nuan Ngok, that line is for the boy himself. One day, he will write it himself, and he was sure that day would come. Not because he is a believer in gods, because, from the bottom of Thien Han's eyes, every time the boy looked at him, he saw himself at 14 years old, trembling in the middle of the night of Tin then, but still secretly hugging the old teacher's torn book with a single message. He who keeps his word, keeps his time. And now, he has kept his word. I just hope that Thien Han, the nameless successor, son of light and darkness, will keep the time. The child who grew up in a bronze mirror. Thang Ho Citadel was at its last splendor. The walls had just been replastered with the embossed phoenix columns were gilded and lacquered, sparkling in the midday sun. Throughout the streets, people were making offerings to celebrate a good harvest, and the royal court continued to hold grand ceremonies as if nothing had happened. But behind the red velvet curtain, among the locked chambers for 4 years, a child was growing up, silent, strange, and as still as the surface of a lake at midnight. His name is Thien Han, and people say it's bigger than anyone else. Thien Han was 3 years old but had never played. He liked to sit quietly under the magnolia tree in the backyard of Kanin Palace, holding a small bronze mirror in his hand. An object engraved with the name of the first king Tyone hung from the previous century. It doesn't shine on your face, it shines on other people. Whenever someone passed by, whether it was a palace maid, a guard, or a high-ranking official who was visiting secretly, he would lift the mirror, tilt it slightly, and stare intently at his reflection. Once, an old imperial physician suddenly saw his image in the mirror distorted into the shadow of a young man wearing a mask. Thien Han just smiled and said, "There is still someone in you who has not lived fully." That sentence kept the old man awake for 3 nights. Queen Hien Yen did not forbid him. She let her son be as free as the wind. But the strange thing was, even though no one was watching, Thien Han never left the confines of Kanin Palace. Once, a palace maid forgot to lock the back gate. The boy just stood there, looked over the wall, then turned back, as quiet as an old man guarding a cemetery. When Trangium asked, "Don't you want to go out?" Thien Han replied, "Out there is someone else's dream." Trangium was silent. By the age of 5, Thien Han had memorized 36 ancient poems, 18 sutras, and could read fluently the general outline of the national law. The strange thing is, no one teaches. The queen only gave her son a few cloth books, Chinese ink, and a box of paper to incubate poems. But every morning, when he opened his eyes, Thien Han would read a poem that no one had ever heard before. Later, it was discovered that it was an ancient handwritten poem that had been lost in the fire at Kintu Library during the Chongqing period. Trangium asked, "Who did you learn from?" The boy smiled softly. "From the dreams of those who have forgotten their names." The bronze mirror, the object Thien Han always carried with him, seemed to have some connection beyond everyday understanding. One early winter night, when Hien Yen was suffering from a high fever, the boy placed the mirror on his mother's forehead and lay next to her, saying nothing. The next morning, she was fine. The royal physicians could not explain. They blamed it on spirit. But Trangium, who had seen the fever that almost killed the late emperor, knew clearly. It was not just a miracle, but it is an exchange. At the age of 6, Thien Han began to ask about death. "Uncle Tran, can the dead still hear the wind? Do they remember who they loved? If a person has never truly lived, then when he dies, is it considered a human life?" Those questions are not those of a child. They are the echoes of souls that have never cried, of memories that have never been named, of cracks that the court is trying to patch with gold and praise. Trangium began to be afraid, not afraid of the child, but fear the reflection it creates in him. One day, Thien Han placed a bronze mirror in his hand. The boy said, "Don't be afraid." He did so. In the mirror, he did not see himself. He only saw the image of a young man standing in the middle of the temple yard, holding a book in his hand, tears welling up in his eyes as he heard the bell ringing. "Who is that?" he asked. Thien Han said softly, "Before I chose to live a life without tears." From that day on, Trangium wrote a new passage in the record. Thien Han is not just a child, he is a mirror. Everyone who looks into it sees their most hidden things. And if the mirror breaks, it will not be because of who threw it, but because no one in this world dares to look straight at it anymore. And he knew the court would not let that mirror exist for long, because no one wants to see the truth. Meeting behind the jade curtain, the Hall of Harmony, which used to be the meeting room of the Council of Three Elders, been closed since the late emperor passed away. But on an early spring night, when the fog covered the Bodhi tree in front of the hall, the ironwood door quietly opened, welcoming three figures in loose robes and black scarves, as silent as ancient shadows just leaving a long dream. Grand Tutor Vandu Sentasu Wan Hun Hun and Prime Minister Louis Vien. On the white stone table was a small map. No boundaries, no strategy. But the family tree is not complete. In the middle is the name Thien Han, written in faded ink. No family name, no title. For the past 4 years, Vandu said in a low voice, this name has been like a cloud hanging over the court. It has neither melted nor fallen. Now, it has grown up, and if I do not name it, sooner or later someone else will do it for me. The monk frowned and said slowly, the court had not yet established a new king, but the people began to spread the story of the reincarnation of a child prodigy, a child who did not cry, knew ancient poetry, and could call the wind. People believed this was the destiny of the dragon. 3 Taoist priests wrote prophecies about the mirror of the century. Lu Yuan nodded. I fear that mirror not only reflects, it also burns, Vandu pondered. So what do we do? The Venerable placed a small roll of silk on the table. A proposal from the head of the royal family, the Li family. He wants to form a nominal brotherhood between the eldest son and Tianxing. If not to destroy him, then to unite him. Grant him the title of Mingtong Gongzi, move him from the inner palace, and send him to the outer palace. There it will be easier to control Lu. Yuan smiled faintly, meaning draw a sword wrapped in silk. No one answered. There was only the sound of the wind blowing in, causing the jade curtain behind them to sway slightly, as if an invisible spirit was listening. The next day, a gratitude edict was sent to Kanin Palace, sealed by the council, without going through the king's hands. Inside was an edict granting the title Min Dong Kong to Thien Han, with flowery words. Because of his extraordinary talent, he was sent to study outside the city and practice virtue in the palace to avoid flatterers and maintain a noble demeanor. Trangiam read, his eyes darkened. He understood. This was not a compliment, but a golden expulsion. He rushed to see the queen. Hian Yen sat in the windless hallway, her eyes still calm as always. She had expected it. They started to be afraid, she said. And when the powerful are afraid, they often use honor as an iron cage. What do you intend to do, Your Majesty? Trangiam asked. She put her hand on her belly. The place that used to be Thien Han's cradle. I cannot stop my son from being taken away, but I can prepare him for something they do not anticipate. Knowledge is not found in books, and faith is not found in power. The night before Thien Han left the inner palace, she called Trangiam and gave him a box of rosewood. Here are 3 letters. One for my son, one for the one who will teach him, one for you, who have kept silent like a half-full moon. He took it, not daring to open it. And if one day my son returns with a crown on his head, let him choose whether to keep the mirror or smash it. Thien Han left the palace on a foggy morning. There was no farewell, just a light gray carriage and a group of soldiers in purple uniforms without insignia. The boy turned back to look at the palace one last time. No tears, just placed his hand on the bronze mirror hanging in front of his chest. The mirror sparkled in the dim sunlight, and at that moment, no one saw that. From the top of Cannin roof, a phoenix feather fell from the phoenix hairpin, gently waving like a waving arm. Footprints in the sand and the broken prophecy that year, Thanho City fell apart from its own silence. No war, no rebellion. There was only a court that was increasingly disoriented, and a throne that had been empty for so long that the dust was thicker than silk. The Council of Three Elders began to age. Vandu fell ill and lost his voice. Thuong Nan withdrew to Lin Sunpaga. Lu Vien was discovered to be secretly trading with the Lu state, and was forced to resign in silence. Meanwhile, a 13-year-old boy in the suburbs, known by the half-legendary name Thien Han, gradually became the center of gossip that was not yet spoken aloud. Thien Han lives in an old palace that used to be a place for the royal family to recuperate. Behind the palace is a vast sandbank leading to the Kinlam River, a place believed to be a sacred water that cleanses the karma of those who have committed serious crimes. He walks there every morning, alone. Don't carry a mirror anymore. The bronze mirror was carefully kept in a brocade box, placed next to the letter mother left behind, still unopened. At the age of 15, he began to grow his hair long, wear coarse cloth, and every day copied the history of the previous dynasty with ink made from Sopri and Orchidashan ink that is now only used in southern ghost rituals. At 16, he wrote a poem. If the wind knows its way back, I wish to be a dry leaf, not green nor yellow, just silently drifting into nothingness. Readers call it a poem from a man who never wanted to be king. One autumn night, when the north wind began to blow, carrying the sound of flutes from the distant pine forest, Thien Han opened his mother's letter. Inside was only one line, written in ink that had faded with time. If one day you feel like you no longer need to find your father, that's when you've become yourself. He smiled softly, and he knew she didn't need to explain further. Not everyone is born with a surname. There are people born to be questions, and sometimes that question is a half-broken prophecy. 3 years later, the court had changed. A high-ranking official, who was a member of the family's patriarchal line, planned to crown his son. But on the night of the ceremony to worship heaven, a fire broke out and burned down the entire palace, leaving only a stone tablet with a faint inscription. The throne is not for those who walk with swords, only for those who bow their heads to the wind. Rumors spread the person who wrote that line was Thien Han. But when the envoy came to the palace outside the city to look for him, he had already left. The palace door was wide open. The bronze mirror left on the table was broken in two. The queen's letter had been burned to ashes, not even sand. Only small footprints remained on the sand behind, leading to the river's edge, where the water still flowed gently, as if it had never carried away a soul. Many years later, the historian noted, "It is not clear whose son Thien Han was. It is not clear in what year he died. It is only clear that after he disappeared, the imperial court automatically chose a successor, as if all the entanglements had been cleared. In the hearts of the people, Thien Han was worshipped as a saint who did not need a statue, someone who had once shown the world a mirror, then quietly withdrew from all eyes. And in Fuan Pagoda, an ancient pagoda where no one practices anymore, on the stone wall there is an unnamed sentence carved. There are children who are not born to grow up, but to let the world know that it is time to wake up." Conclusion. The mirror remains in each person. There are stories that don't need to be understood, just felt. And the son of the bronze mirror is such a story. A child with no father in the records, no family name on the golden board, no throne to sit on, but with eyes that silenced all powers. A creature born between the blood moon and the north wind, not crying, not demanding, only looking and reflecting. Reflects the fears of those in power, reflecting the unnamed aspirations of history's voiceless. Reflects the deepest part of us, where we have forgotten who we were, what we wanted, and wished that life could be a little easier. The mirror that Thien Han carried finally broke, but the reflection did not. Because the strange thing is, a broken mirror can turn into 100 pieces. Each small piece is an open human eye, and when we look in, sometimes what we see is not a face, but a soul. We close the story today, but who knows? Thien Han is still present in this world, in the form of a child, quiet, different, and refusing to bow his head obediently. If you encounter such a look, please do not be afraid, because maybe you are standing in front of the mirror that history left for you. Subscribe to the channel if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, and don't forget, every crack in history is a place where light can enter.